Hello and welcome to this tutorial where we want to take a look at how we can create a procedural tile material inside of Blender with the Octane render engine. And on the right hand side here you can already see the material that looks quite a bit complex, but in itself it is actually quite simple. I've colored in the different parts of our material that we have here, and in light blue back here, we have the tile pattern that we create with a few nodes. Up here in red, we have the colorization of the mortar in between the tiles. Down here in green, we have the roughness setup. In gray, we have the bump setup. And in light yellow, we have a displacement setup that then all goes into one universal material. Okay, to start creating this procedural tile material, we will delete the whole material and then we start all over again. As already visible inside of our 3D viewport, you can see that I have stripped the sphere inside of my scene from the procedural tile pattern material, and in the background I just have a simple HDRI that is used to light our scene. If you want to use the same HDRI, I will link the HDRI I'm using inside of the video description. And I will link a video on how to create such an HDRI setup inside of Blender with Octane in the upper right-hand corner right now. Please make sure that for the material to work properly, we will need an object that has quite a few subdivisions, so that we have a bit of geometry that we can use for displacement later. From here, we can now start creating our procedural tile material. To do that, we will go up here into our shader editor. We will make sure that the shader editor is set to object. And then up here, we will have the new button. Please make sure that the object that you want to apply the material to is selected. If we click on new, Octane will already create a universal material for us that we also want to use for our procedural tile material today. We will start by adding in our tile pattern, and for that we will need a tile patterns node. We press Shift A and we search for tile patterns node. Here it is. And if we take the texture out of this node and plug it into the albedo of our universal material, we can see inside of our 3D viewport that we already get a tile pattern. Inside of our tile patterns node, we want to change a few things. The type is already set to bricks. This is correct. And then we can change the color 1 and color 2 of the tiles. I've already picked two colors. For color 1, I want to use the color with a hex code of 56649B. And for the tile color 2, I want the color with the hex code for C64B3. And the line color should be pitch black. For the line width, we want to use a width of 0.01, and then we want to change the scale of our tile pattern. We will do that by clicking on this little plus down here at UV transform, and this will automatically create a 3D transform node for us. In here we want to change the first scale value to 0.2, and the other two we want to set to 0.4. As you can see inside of our 3D viewport, the tile pattern has changed a bit. It looks much more appropriate when it comes to the scale. Of course, you can change the scale inside this 3D transformation node to suit your scale for your object. But in my case, these values make totally sense. Okay, from here we will continue. We want to change the color of our mortar in between of our tiles. Right now, the color for this is set to black. This is important because we need that for our displacement later. So we can't change the watercolor inside of this tile patterns node, but we have to do this differently. In order for that, I will take these nodes and put them a bit to the left for us to have a bit of space to work with. And now we have to create a few nodes. First of all, we need a mixed texture node by pressing Shift A again and searching for a mixed texture node. And we take this one and put it in between of our tile patterns node and the universal material. We have to take the tile patterns texture out and plug it into the second second texture of our mixed texture node. And then we will search for an RGB color node. We will take the texture out of the RGB color node and put it into the first texture of our mixed texture node. Then we also need a gradient map. So we press Shift A again and search for a gradient map. Now we can take the tile patterns texture out and plug it into the input texture of our gradient map. The texture out of the gradient map should go into the amount of the mixed texture node. Now our material has completely turned white. This is not what we want. In order for us to change this, we have to go into the linear of our gradient map and change it to constant. Now we will take the white value on the right side and put it all the way to the left. And now we can see that the blue color has reappeared and our mortar is white in between the tiles. This is exactly what we want. We basically filter out everything except the mortar and then turn this part white with this RGB color node. If you want your mortar to be another color, you can change that in here. For example, now it is blue as well. I will set it back to white because I want my mortar to be white. This is it for the albedo and the color. Now we can continue by adding in a bit of roughness for our tiles. In order to change the roughness of our mortar and the tiles separately, we will have to make a similar setup to the one that we have up here. We will need another mixed texture node for this. So we press Shift A again and search for mixed texture node. Then we will take RGB color right here. And we also want gradient map. We will take the mixed texture out and we will plug it into the roughness of our universal material. And then we take the RGB color texture out and plug it into the first texture of our mixed texture. And we take the gradient map texture out and plug it into the second texture of our mixed texture node. And then we will have to take the gradient map texture out up here from our color mortar setup, and we will plug it into the mixed texture amount. Perfect. Now we want to add our texture that we want to use for the roughness. In my case, I have sought out a surface imperfection texture that I downloaded from Polygon. I will link the texture in the video description so that you can download this texture as well. It is free, so it should be no problem there. You can just drag and drop the texture in here like I will do. Here's my RGB image with my texture. And now I can take the texture out and plug it into the input texture of our gradient map. Please make sure when dragging in the RGB image of the texture that you take the texture with the black background and not the white one for this to work properly. Now we also want to change the scale of our image texture, and we do that by pressing the little plus again down here at UV transform. And then we take the gradient map texture out and plug it into the second texture of our mixed texture node. And we will take the RGB color texture out and plug it into the first texture of our mixed texture node. And inside of this 3D transformation node, we will change the scale for all three values to 0.166. That is perfect. And now we are finished with the roughness. When I zoom in a bit, we can see that there are slight smudges on our material. This is exactly what we want. It might be that on YouTube this is not as visible as it is when you are using Blender yourself. And we have roughness value that is making the mortar not shiny and our tiles shiny and reflective. This is exactly what we want for our tiles. And now we will continue by adding in bump to our tiles. We want the bump because it will distort the reflections of our tiles, and this will give a pretty unique look for tiles. You will see what I mean by that in a minute. So we go down to the bump connector of our universal material, and here we will start by using a gradient map. So we press Shift-A and search for a gradient map. And we take the texture out of our gradient map and put it into the bump connector of the universal material. Then we will add in a noise texture. Down here it is. And we take the texture out of our noise texture and plug it into the input texture of the gradient map. The gradient map in this case is only here to give us a little bit more control over the noise texture, but I won't change anything in here. As you can see inside of our 3D viewport, we already get a result that is actually quite good. So if you want, you can leave all the values as they are in here, but I will change a few things. First of all, I want the octaves to be at 3 and the omega to be at 1. Then I want to change the contrast to around 8.2. And as you can see down here, we get a much stronger distortion effect of our reflections. Of course, you can set this noise texture to your preferences, but in my case, I also want to scale this noise texture a bit. So I want to change all three scale values inside of this 3D transformation node to 1.5. Perfect. This looks fine for me. And now we can continue. In order to give our tile material or procedural tile material the finishing touch, we want to add a displacement, because right now our tiles don't really look 3D. They are pretty plain. The mortar is basically on the same level as our tiles are, and this is not what we want. So we want to create displacement. We will do that by going down to the displacement connector of our universal material. And now we need a texture displacement node. Down here is the texture displacement. We will take the displacement out of our texture displacement and put it into the displacement connector of our universal material. And in here we want to change a few things. We want the mid-level set to 0.5, the level of detail to 4K. The height should be set to 0.02 and the filter type to Gaussian. And the filter radius we want to set to 4. Because we are using a node up here that is not an RGB texture in a sense, we will need a baking texture node. And we get this one by pressing Shift-A and searching for a baking texture. Right here it is. We take the texture out of the baking texture and plug it into the texture of our texture displacement. And in here we will change the resolution to 2048. We will set the sample per pixel to 64. And then we can leave the rest. Okay, Now we will need an add texture node. So we press Shift A and search for an add texture node. Here it is. And we take the texture out of our add texture and plug it into the texture connector of our backing texture. Okay, now we want a gradient map. And we plug the texture out of the gradient map into the texture 2 connector of the add texture node. And now we have to go up to our tiles patterns node. And this tile patterns node, we will plug into the input texture of the gradient map that we just created. And we take another string out of it, plug it into the texture 1 of our add texture node down here. As you can see on the left-hand side inside of our viewport, the displacement is already working, and we have a smooth transition between our tiles, the mortar in between, and the next tile. Perfect. This is already it for our tile material. It is quite complex, but step for step, it should be possible to follow along. Please like this video if you could follow along easily, and please subscribe if you want more content about Blender with Octane. I hope you can use this material to your advantage in your projects, and I will see you next time inside of Blender with Octane.